My name is Emily Warren. I am 30 years old. And for years, I thought the greatest pain was being overlooked at Christmas dinner in Davenport, surrounded by cousins, relatives, and neighbors. My father raised his glass and said the words that cut deeper than anything I had ever heard. He called me a failure in front of everyone, then turned and praised my younger sister Sophia as the pride of the family. I stayed silent, but behind that silence lived years of sacrifices no one knew about. I had paid the debts, saved the house, even covered the dreams Sophia boasted about, while they dismissed me as ordinary. That night, I realized silence could become the sharpest weapon. What happened afterward turned my family upside down and forced them to face truths they had buried for years. Stay with me until the end, because this story will show you how one dinner table humiliation became the beginning of a reckoning. None of them expected. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation filled the dining room of my parents' house in Davenport. Iova. The smell of roasted turkey and sweet cranberry sauce lingered in the warm air, while laughter bounced off the walls adorned with tinsel and red bows. It was Christmas night, and the entire Warren family had gathered around the long oak table, cousins squeezed shoulder to shoulder. My Aunt Margaret, near the end, with her polite smile, and my parents at the head of the table. I sat halfway down, a glass of eggnog in front of me, trying to enjoy the holiday cheer. Then my father's voice cut through the room. "You are a failure." His words landed heavy, each syllable sharp enough to slice through the chatter. He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes hard and unflinching. "But your sister Sophia is not. She is the pride of this family." A hush fell over the table. Forks paused in midair. My chest tightened, as if the whole room had shrunk around me. I glanced at Sophia, sitting 2 seats away in her sequined dress, her glossy hair catching the glow of the chandelier. She smiled faintly, almost embarrassed, but not enough to stop her from enjoying the praise. I pressed my palms against my lap, willing myself to stay calm. The sting of his words burned hotter than the candles flickering between the platters of stuffing and sweet potatoes. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but the weight of my family's eyes kept me silent. My cousin Mark shifted uncomfortably beside me, his fork scratching against his plate. Aunt Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. The only sound was the faint pop of the fire in the living room, crackling as if it too had heard the insult. My mother Eleanor smoothed the edge of the tablecloth with her hand, her eyes darting between my father and me. She did not speak either. Her silence was just as sharp, just as painful as his words. I swallowed hard, eggnog thick in my throat. 30 years old. A career in Chicago I had built with endless nights of work and study. And still to him, I was nothing. A failure. My father raised his glass of wine, his voice louder now, as if to make sure the cousins at the far end of the table heard every word. "To Sophia," it declared, "our shining star. Look at everything she has accomplished. We could not be more proud." The cousins clapped politely, though a few eyes flicked toward me. Sophia lowered her head modestly. "But has mir betrayal her delight." I sat frozen, heat rising up my neck. Jake's burning. Memories flashed behind my eyes. The nights I wired money home to cover overdue bills. The weekends I skipped vacations so that my sister could pay her tuition. The months I scraped by in a small apartment while I sent checks back to Davenport. None of that mattered here. None of it ever had. The chatter picked up again. Awkward at first, then louder, as if to erase the moment. My father leaned closer to Sophia, asking about her new projects, her latest posts, her growing followers. He hung on every word, nodding proudly. While I sat invisible at the same table, I cut into my slice of turkey, the meat dry in my mouth. the taste of bitterness stronger than any seasoning. My hands trembled slightly as I set down the fork. I told myself to breathe, to keep my composure. Tonight was not the night to fight. Sophia's voice rose over the crowd, bright and full of confidence, as she spoke of collaborations and opportunities with a media group in Des Moines. My father's laughter boomed in response. His glass raised once more in her honor. The candlelight shimmered across the polished glasses. But the room felt colder to me than the snow outside. I forced a faint smile at a passing comment from a cousin, though my mind was far away, drifting to the years of sacrifice buried under their ignorance. As my father's toast ended, he looked down the table in my direction. His eyes lingered on me for just a second, carrying no warmth, only dismissal. He turned away quickly, clinking glasses with Sophia. I stayed silent, my lips pressed together, my jaw aching from the restraint. I could feel Aunt Margaret's eyes on me, sympathetic yet restrained, as if she too knew that speaking up would only fuel the fire. The laughter around me grew louder, blending with the rustle of plates and the murmur of conversations. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the sounds wash over me, my thoughts sinking deep. My father's words would not leave me. They replayed in my head, louder than the chatter, louder than the clinking glasses. A failure. He had branded me in front of everyone I loved, and I had chosen silence. I wrapped my fingers around the cool glass of eggnog, lifting it to my lips, just to give myself something to do. The sweetness coated my tongue, but it did nothing to soften the bitterness inside. Sophia beamed as another cousin complimented her dress, her success, her charm. My father's proud laughter followed, and my mother sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The room brimmed with warmth and festivity for everyone but me, and so I sat, silent, the hum of Christmas cheer around me, while the words of my father burned like an ember in the hollow of my chest. The laughter at the table faded into a dull blur as my mind pulled me backward to the years that had brought me here. I remembered the spring of 2015, fresh out of college with my finance degree from the University of Illinois, stepping into my first job at a firm in downtown Chicago. I was only 23, nervous and eager, riding the train every morning past the river, clutching my worn leather briefcase as if it carried my worth. That first year was brutal. Long hours, endless spreadsheets, the constant pressure of proving myself. While my coworkers left for happy hours, I stayed late, poring over numbers until my eyes blurred. My paycheck was modest, barely enough for my cramped studio apartment on the north side. But even then, before I had settled into a rhythm of my own life, I was sending money back home. Sophia had just begun her master's program in communications at Iowa State, and tuition bills arrived like clockwork. I told myself it was temporary, that once she graduated and got a good job, she would be able to stand on her own. I believed it when she called late at night crying that she was overwhelmed, that she could not manage the debt, that Mom and Dad could not help. So I wired money from my own savings, living on ramen and cutting corners just to make sure she could stay enrolled. Sophia's social media pages bloomed with glossy pictures of campus events, stylish outfits, and smiles that hid the truth. Relatives commented about how independent she was, how she had ambition. At family gatherings, my father boasted about her studies, about her bright future. No one ever mentioned my name. Though the checks had my signature, the memory stung, sharp and vivid. Thanksgiving, 2016. I drove 5 hours from Chicago to Davenport, exhausted from a week of closing quarterly reports. My father carved the turkey, his voice booming as he announced to the cousins around the table. "Sophia is our hope," he said. "She is destined for bigger things." He looked at me then, his eyes flat. "Emily is fine too." just doing her office job in the city. His words hung heavy. Dismissive, I swallowed my pride with spoonfuls of mashed potatoes, telling myself it was only temporary. But temporary stretched into years. By 2018, Sophia had graduated. Diploma in hand. And instead of finding steady work, she launched a lifestyle blog. She called it her passion project. She wanted to show young women how to live with elegance and confidence. I watched the page load on my laptop one late night in my Chicago apartment. Photos of her draped in new clothes, traveling to conferences, sipping lattes with perfectly manicured nails. The reality was that those flights and dresses were covered by the money I quietly funneled her way. I told myself again that it was fine. That family took care of each other. Still, every transfer I made dug deeper into my own future. When my colleagues at the firm pooled money for a weekend ski trip to Colorado, I declined, saying I needed to catch up on work. The truth was, my bank account could not carry both me and Sophia. I thought of a night in 2019 when the firm had offered me a small promotion. I was proud, ready to share the news. I called home, voice bright, and told Dad I was now a senior analyst. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "That is good, Emily. But did you see Sophia's latest article went viral? She is really going places." I hung up quietly, staring at my reflection in the dark window. The city lights flickering behind me. The pattern never broke. Every success of hers was paraded as proof of her brilliance. Every sacrifice of mine folded into silence. And the family believed it. Or perhaps they wanted to. Sophia, the shining star. Emily, the one who was fine but nothing special. I remembered a summer barbecue in 2020 at our backyard in Davenport. The air smelled of charcoal and cut grass. Kids ran with sparklers, and neighbors crowded the lawn. My father raised his beer, calling out for everyone's attention. "Sophia has such a future ahead," it declared. "Emily, you are steady enough. But Sophia is the one who will make a mark." People clapped. Sophia laughed modestly, and I forced a smile, as if the words had not just carved me open. The ember of that memory flared now. Sitting at the Christmas table, years later, listening again to the same praise and the same dismissal, my chest ached with the repetition of it. The years of wiring money, of staying silent, of believing my turn would come. All of it pressed down on me like the weight of the snow piled outside the windows. Sophia leaned closer to Dad that Christmas night, her laughter soft and charming, while he nodded along, proud and beaming. And in the middle of that warmth, I sat as I always had, holding in the truth that without me there would have been no tuition, no blog, no shining star to toast. I lifted my glass, the eggnog cool against my lips, and stared down at the tablecloth, patterned with holly leaves. I kept my silence, but inside the memories churned like a storm. Years of wounds stitched together with threads of duty. The glow of the candles flickered, shadows dancing across faces that still could not see what I had given. And in that moment, I felt the old sting of my father's voice echo again. "Sophia has a future," he once said. "You are just ordinary." The words returned as clear as if he had just spoken them, and they burned as fiercely as the ember smoldering inside my chest. Sophia leaned forward, her sequined sleeve catching the chandelier light as she lifted her glass. Her voice carried easily over the hum of conversation, practiced and confident. The kind of voice that made people lean in. She was telling the table about her new partnership with Midwest Media Group, explaining how they had approached her to create a series on modern lifestyle trends. She described it with enthusiasm, her hands gesturing gracefully, her face glowing with excitement. The cousins at the far end of the table listened with admiration, murmuring words of encouragement. My father's face practically shone with pride. He looked at Sophia as if she were the proof of his own success, the legacy he would leave behind. My mother's eyes softened, her smile full of approval. It was as though they believed they were all basking in the reflection of Sophia's light. I sat in the middle of it, my fork resting untouched on my plate, the green beans on my dish cooling with every word she spoke. I watched her talk about her travels, her photo shoots, her blog posts going viral. Each detail pierced into me because I knew exactly what it had cost to make it possible. The shiny new camera equipment she boasted about had been purchased on a credit card under my name. The flight to New York for a media conference, where she posted dozens of smiling photos, had been booked after she sent me a frantic call that she could not afford it. I had covered the cost and quietly gone without a vacation that year. Yet here she was, painting her life as a portrait of ambition and independence. And everyone at the table was clapping their hands softly against the wood, admiring her. My father reached across to pat her shoulder. "That is ambition," he said. "That is what makes me proud." The sting of his words landed again, even sharper than before. My chest tightened with the familiar ache, and I glanced down to my lap, hiding the storm in my eyes. Sophia tilted her head, pretending to be modest. "I am just grateful for the opportunities," she said sweetly, lowering her lashes as if the success had fallen into her hands by luck. I wanted to laugh, bitter and loud, because I remembered the emails she had sent me in the middle of the night, begging for help. The texts filled with panic about deadlines and bills. The truth was not luck. It was me. The conversation around the table swelled again. A cousin leaned toward his wife, whispering about how impressive Sophia was. My stomach twisted at the words, and I reached for my glass of water, the condensation slick in my grip. Under the table, a gentle pressure brushed against my hand. Startled, I looked down to see Aunt Margaret's fingers resting on mine. When I lifted my gaze, her eyes met mine with quiet understanding. She did not smile, but her look told me she had seen what the others had ignored. She always noticed. In that moment, I felt the smallest flicker of strength return, just enough to steady my breath. Then a cousin's voice rang out, cutting through the laughter. "Emily, how about you? How is your work in Chicago?" Dozens of eyes turned in my direction. My throat closed as heat climbed up my neck. I wanted to answer, to tell them the truth. I wanted to describe the long hours at the firm in Chicago, the late nights staring at spreadsheets until my eyes blurred, the promotion to senior analyst that I had earned without favors or shortcuts. I wanted them to understand that my steady path was not dull. It was strength, that I had carried more weight on my shoulders than anyone in this room knew. But just as I opened my mouth, my father chuckled. He leaned back in his chair, waving a dismissive hand as if the question did not deserve my answer. "She just works an office job. Nothing special," he said. "Nothing compared to Sophia's accomplishments." The words sliced through me. I shut my mouth, swallowing the lump in my throat. Around the table, the chatter stumbled for a moment. Awkward silence, stretching like a tight wire. My cousin shifted in his seat, his face tight with discomfort. Then someone laughed, and the conversation swerved back toward Sophia as if nothing had been said. I sat frozen, my cheeks burning. The humiliation settled heavy in my chest, not because he had dismissed me, but because he had done it so easily, so naturally, as if that had always been my role in this family. The invisible one, the ordinary one. Aunt Margaret's eyes lingered on me. Her lips pressed together as though she wanted to speak, but knew the damage was already done. She let her hand fall back into her lap, but the warmth of her earlier touch stayed with me. The room roared again with Sophia's voice. She told stories of photo shoots, of brands offering free products, of her growing followers online. My father laughed loudly at her jokes, raising his wine glass once more to toast her bright future. My mother's smile widened. Her hands folded delicately on the tablecloth, as if she was savoring every moment. I lowered my gaze to my plate, the half-eaten turkey and congealed gravy staring back at me. My appetite had vanished long ago, replaced by the hollow ache of years of sacrifices, erased by a few careless words. The sound of the fire crackled faintly from the living room. Outside, faint singing drifted from a group of carolers passing down the snowy street. The house glowed with warmth and holiday cheer, but none of it reached me. I steadied my breathing, lifted my glass, and took another sip of water. I told myself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. They would not see me break. They would not know how much it hurt. Sophia leaned across the table, telling my father about her next collaboration. His eyes shone with pride, his face alight with admiration. And I sat in the middle of it all, surrounded by laughter and cheer, my silence heavy, my sacrifice hidden in the shadows of her smile. I glanced once more at Aunt Margaret, who gave me the faintest nod, a signal that she had witnessed the exchange. It was a small thread of comfort in a room where I otherwise felt entirely alone. I picked up my fork again, pushing the green beans around my plate, pretending to eat while the conversation carried on above me. The noise swelled until it blurred into a single sound, a dull hum against the storm that churned inside me. And so I stayed, invisible beneath the glow of the chandelier, while Sophia's laughter filled the air, her success celebrated by everyone in the room. My father raised his glass yet again, his words echoing over the table, a toast for the daughter he adored, while his other daughter sat silently, her own story buried in the shadows. When the plates were cleared and the last of the pie slices passed around, I slipped quietly out the back door. The night air hit me sharp and cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes every breath visible. Snow crunched under my boots as I stepped onto the wooden porch. I wrapped my arms around myself, pulling my coat tighter, and let the laughter from inside fade into a muffled hum behind the glass. The yard stretched out under a pale moon, the trees bare and brittle against the winter sky. I stood there, staring at the neighbors' lights twinkling faintly across the street, and memories I tried to bury came rushing back. I thought of the spring of 2017, when my father had called me, his voice low and urgent. They had maxed out 2 credit cards, interest piling high, and collection calls were coming daily. I was barely managing in Chicago on my analyst's salary, yet I wired the money. I told myself it was my duty. I told myself I could rebuild later. Then came the summer of 2018, when the bank nearly seized the family home. A loan my father had taken for repairs had fallen into default, the notices piling up in the mailbox. He called me in tears, something I had rarely heard from him. Without hesitation, I drained nearly all of my savings to bring the payments current. I had walked into the branch office in Chicago, handed the teller a cashier's check, and felt my stomach hollow out as she stamped the receipt. No one at home ever mentioned it again. The house stood, the roof repaired, the lights on. And at the next Christmas, my father lifted his glass to Sophia for her supposed independence. I rubbed my hands together now against the cold, staring out at the empty garden. My breath came in slow clouds as my jaw tightened. All the vacations I had never taken, the apartments I had chosen for price instead of comfort, the new coats or shoes I never bought. Every sacrifice had been poured into this family, and not a soul at that table cared enough to acknowledge it. The back door opened behind me with a squeak of the hinge. I did not need to turn to know it was my mother. Her perfume, faint and floral, drifted on the cold air. She stepped out carefully, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I waited for her to speak words of comfort. I waited for her to say she had heard my father's cruelty, that she knew it was unfair, that she understood my silence was strength and not weakness. Instead, she let out a soft sigh and said, "Do not take it to heart. Emily, you know how your father is. He just gets carried away. Sophia is the one who really needs us right now." Her words landed heavier than the snow collecting on the railing. I turned my head toward her slowly, searching her face for some sign that she did not mean it. But her expression was calm, resigned, almost as if she had rehearsed the line. I bit down hard, the taste of iron rising at the edge of my tongue where I had clenched too tightly. My chest ached with the effort to hold back the storm of words building inside me. All I wanted was for her to admit, just once, that my sacrifices had mattered, that she had seen me, that she understood. Instead, she pulled her shawl closer and looked back toward the glowing windows where Sophia's laughter still spilled out, mingled with my father's booming cheer. "We all have our roles," she said softly, almost to herself. I turned back to the snow, blinking against the sting in my eyes. My lips pressed together so hard they trembled, and I forced the tears not to fall. My teeth ground against one another, the muscles in my jaw screaming with tension. I wanted to scream, to shout into the night about the checks I had written, the nights I had gone without, the way I had kept them from sinking when they could not keep themselves afloat. But no words came. Only silence. The same silence I had carried for years. The same silence that had become my armor. The wind picked up, lifting a few loose flakes of snow from the porch rail. My mother gave one last glance toward me, her eyes unreadable, then turned and slipped back inside. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone again in the cold. I stayed there for a long while, listening to the muffled sounds of my family celebrating inside, my father's laughter ringing loud, Sophia's voice bright and confident, the warmth of the house and the glow of its lights pressed against the dark night. But he stood outside, letting the chill bite into my skin. My mouth set in a thin line. I clenched my hands into fists, deep in my pockets, the fabric tight around my knuckles. My breath came harsh and visible in the air, each exhale a reminder of the fire I was holding in. I had been erased at that table, erased by my father's pride in Sophia, erased by my mother's quiet dismissal, erased by the silence of the relatives who dared not speak up. The snow kept falling, slow and steady, covering the ground in a white sheet, muffling the world into stillness. I stood within it, the night pressing in on me, my body rigid with restraint. My mother's words echoed in my ears. "Sophia is the one who really needs us." I bit down harder, my jaw aching, my throat thick. In that moment I knew with painful clarity that to them, I would never be the one who needed or deserved anything. I was the giver, the safety net, the quiet support in the background. I was never the pride of the family, only the insurance policy. The wind stung my cheeks, and I finally let out a slow breath, my lips parting, the taste of bitterness sharp on my tongue. I turned my face upward toward the sky, the snowflakes landing soft against my skin, melting into the heat of my frustration. Inside the house, another round of laughter erupted, louder this time, the clinking of glasses celebrating Sophia once again. I closed my eyes, pressed my lips together, and held the silence so tightly it felt like it might break me in two. The train swayed gently as it pulled away from Davenport, the hum of the engine vibrating through the worn seat beneath me. I sat by the window, my reflection faint against the black night outside, snowflakes streaking past like sparks. The laughter from my parents' house still echoed in my ears, but out here, in the quiet of the train, I finally let my shoulders drop. The holiday cheer was behind me, fading into the distance with every mile of track. But the words of my father and the silence of my mother clung like frost to my chest. I pulled my laptop from my bag, the familiar weight of it grounding me. The screen lit up the small space, a pale glow casting shadows across my tired face. My fingers hovered over the keys before I clicked open the file I had built over the years. A record I had updated with care and precision. Rows and columns filled the screen, neat and unforgiving, each line a piece of my sacrifice. The first entry was from March 2015. Tuition payment. Iowa State University. $5,200. I remembered the panic in Sophia's voice when she had called, saying she could not register for classes. I had just started at the firm in Chicago, barely scraping by on an entry-level salary. But I sent the money anyway. Scrolling down, the years unfolded like a ledger of my own erasure. July 2016. Credit card bill for my father. $3,000. November 2017. Emergency dental bill for my mother. $1,400. May 2018. Delinquent home repair loan. $12,000. Over and over. The numbers stacked up, bleeding into each other, until the total at the bottom glared back at me. $85,476. My chest tightened as I stared at it. That was nearly a down payment on a condo in Chicago. Nearly the seed money for investments I had dreamed of making. Instead, it was gone, siphoned into the endless pit of family emergencies and Sophia's ambitions. The rhythm of the train clattered beneath me, steady and relentless, like the beat of my own heart. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs, breathing through the wave of anger and exhaustion that rose. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, as if mocking my stillness. What would happen if I stopped? The question slipped into my mind uninvited, curling itself into the quiet space. What if I never sent another transfer? Never bailed them out again? Never answered another desperate call in the middle of the night? Would the family still laugh so freely, praising Sophia's independence? If the safety net disappeared, I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window, watching the blurred lights of small towns pass by. For years I had convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that family came first, that my sacrifices were temporary. But temporary had turned into permanent, and permanent had turned into expectation. They did not just accept my help anymore. They depended on it as if it were their right. My throat tightened as I remembered the words my mother had spoken on the porch. Her voice soft but cutting. Sophia is the one who really needs us. Not me. Never me. I looked back at the screen, at the total, flashing like an accusation. My finger hovered over the trackpad. Trembling slightly, I highlighted the bottom row, bolded the number, and sat there staring at it until my eyes blurred. The train rocked as it crossed the Mississippi River Bridge, the sound of steel against steel echoing through the car. A man 2 seats ahead shifted in his sleep, his breath heavy, oblivious to the storm unraveling in my chest. I thought about the life I could have had, the trips I could have taken, the security I could have built for myself, the peace I might have felt if I had not been carrying the weight of everyone else. I thought of my coworkers at the firm who had bought homes, started families, built something lasting, while I drained myself to keep another person's image afloat. But beneath it, a strange calm began to take hold. Flowsend. My shoulders settled back against the seat. For the first time, I let the idea breathe without suffocating it. What if I chose myself? What if I simply said no? My hands moved before I fully realized it. I clicked into the file, scrolled to the bottom, and added a final note. December 2022. Last entry. Christmas. Davenport. Final straw. I stared at the words. Simple and stark. And then I pressed save. The click was soft, almost insignificant. But to me it felt like the weight of years shifting. The screen dimmed slightly, reflecting my own eyes back at me. Sharp and tired, but resolute. I closed the laptop and let it rest on my lap. My hands folded over it. The silence of the train car pressed in, broken only by the steady rhythm of the tracks. Outside, the snow-covered fields stretched endlessly, the moonlight painting them silver. The world looked untouched, pure and clean. And for the first time in years, I imagined stepping into it without chains binding me back to Davenport. My chest still ached, but the ache was steadier now, less wild. I tilted my head back against the seat, breathing deeply, letting the decision settle like stone in my bones. I had saved their house, their credit, their pride. I had covered Sophia's dreams and shielded them from ruin. But tonight, staring at the numbers I had carried, I knew something with certainty. The safety net was gone. The train pressed on through the night, and I sat there, eyes open, my resolve hardening with every mile. The Monday morning after Christmas was gray and bitterly cold in Chicago. Wind swept down the canyon of glass towers, carrying with it the sting of snow that never seemed to melt on the sidewalks. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck and hurried into the familiar warmth of the office building on LaSalle Street, my boots squeaking faintly on the marble floor. The holiday decorations still hung in the lobby, but to me they looked tired, like the remnants of a party that had already ended. By the time I reached my desk on the 22nd floor, Daniel was already there, leaning against the partition with a cup of coffee in hand. His tie was slightly crooked, his brown hair sticking up at the crown as if he had rushed in. He studied me carefully, as he always did when something weighed on me. "Rough holiday," he said gently, offering me a paper cup filled with the second coffee he always brought for me. I took it with a nod, the steam curling against my face. "You could say that." We sat in the small lounge near the window, the skyline stretching behind us in sharp steel and glass. I told him everything. The dinner table, my father's words, my mother's silence, Sophia's endless stories of success paid for with my sacrifice. The more I spoke, the more my voice shook. Not with tears, but with the exhaustion of years, finally spoken out loud. Daniel listened, his expression shifting between disbelief and anger. When I finished, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Emily, this isn't just unfair, it's toxic. You have been carrying them for years, and they've built their whole image on your back." I stared down at the swirl of foam on my coffee. "Silent," he continued, his voice steady. "You need protection. If you stop paying, they are going to lash out. They'll blame you for everything. You need someone on your side who knows the law." "Ah, Lavier," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "Exactly," he said. "Someone who can help you set boundaries and keep them from dragging you back into the same cycle." The idea settled into me, solid and undeniable. For so long I had thought of lawyers as something other people needed. People in messy divorces or lawsuits, but I realized Daniel was right. My family would not quietly accept the loss of their safety net. They would fight, and I could not face that fight alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur of spreadsheets and conference calls, but the thought of finding legal counsel lingered in the back of my mind. When I returned home that evening, my small apartment felt heavier than usual. I set my bag down, pulled off my boots, and collapsed onto the couch. The city buzzed faintly outside my window, horns and sirens blending into the winter night. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I almost ignored it. But the name on the screen froze me. Aunt Margaret. I hesitated. Then answered. Her voice was steady, low but firm. Emily. I saw what happened at dinner. I saw the way your father spoke to you. And the way no one defended you. My throat tightened. I stayed quiet. Waiting. She went on. I want you to know. I am not blind to what you have done for this family. I know you covered those bills. I know you saved their house more than once. I am a lawyer. And I am willing to help you if they come after you. I closed my eyes. The weight of her words sinking deep. All these years I had felt like a shadow, unseen and unheard. And now, for the first time, someone was telling me they had witnessed it all. Thank you, I whispered, my voice raw. She exhaled softly through the line. You don't have to fight them alone, Emily. If you decide to make a change, I will stand with you. When we ended the call, I sat in silence, the phone still warm in my hand. My apartment was quiet, the radiator hissing faintly in the corner. For the first time in years, I felt a sliver of light pierce through the darkness. Daniel's words replayed in my head, mingling with Aunt Margaret's protection, support, boundaries. I opened my laptop again, pulling up the file with the ledger of my sacrifices. The bolded number at the bottom glared back at me. $85,476. My hands no longer trembled. I knew what I had to do. I closed the computer and leaned back into the couch. The night outside was quiet, the snow finally settling. My heart still ached, but in its center was something new, something steady. For the first time, I was not standing alone. The following week, I found myself pushing open the heavy glass door of a law office, tucked between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner on Michigan Avenue. The brass plaque beside the entrance read Sullivan and Parker, attorneys at law. My boots tracked slush across the tile floor as I stepped inside, brushing flakes of snow from my coat. The receptionist, a young woman with neat blonde hair pulled into a bun, offered me a polite smile. Do you have an appointment? Yes. With Mark Sullivan, I replied, my voice steady though my palms felt damp. She nodded and gestured toward a row of chairs upholstered in gray fabric. Please have a seat. He will be right with you. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. A stack of law journals sat neatly on the table beside me, their covers sharp and unwelcoming. I clasped my hands in my lap, staring at the second hand of the clock tick slowly around, each beat marking the weight of what I was about to do. A door creaked open, and a tall man with salt and pepper hair stepped into the room, adjusting his glasses. Emily Warren. I rose to my feet. Yes, that's me. He offered a firm handshake. Mark Sullivan. Come on back. His office was warm, lined with shelves of thick books and framed degrees. The blinds were half drawn, letting in slivers of pale winter light that stretched across the polished wood desk. He motioned for me to sit, then settled into the leather chair opposite me. Tell me what brings you here, Emily. I hesitated, then pulled the folder from my bag and laid it on the desk. Inside were years of statements, contracts, copies of emails, and the spreadsheet I had built with painstaking care. My sacrifices laid out in numbers and signatures. He adjusted his glasses again, leafing through the papers with careful precision. I sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside, my hands tightening around the arms of the chair. After several minutes, he looked up. You have been supporting them financially for years, but everything is in your name. The loans, the credit cards, even the mortgage guarantee. I nodded. They leaned on me because my credit was strong. I thought I was helping. His gaze softened slightly. You were helping, but you have no legal obligation to continue. If you want to end this, you can. The air in my chest loosened, a breath escaping before I realized I had been holding it. So, I am allowed to pull out, to stop paying. Absolutely. These documents show you are the guarantor. But you are not bound for life. You can withdraw your guarantee at the bank, and from that point on, it becomes their responsibility. I swallowed, my throat dry. What will happen if I do? He folded his hands. The bank will notify your parents and your sister. They will have to make the payments themselves or face consequences. It may strain your family relationships. But legally, you will be free. I stared down at the file, at the rows of numbers and notes I had carried for so long. My heart pounded in my chest, not just from fear, but from the clarity of his words. Free. When can we start? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He offered a reassuring nod. We can draft the withdrawal paperwork today. If you are ready, we can visit the bank together this afternoon. The clock ticked on the wall, and I nodded slowly, my decision firming with every beat. Yes, I am ready. That afternoon, the wind cut against my cheeks as we walked up the steps of First Iowa Bank on Wabash Avenue. The building's stone facade loomed over us, the brass handles of the door cold beneath my grip. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polish and pine from the fading holiday decorations. A teller guided us to a private office where a manager in a navy suit introduced himself. Mr. Sullivan explained the purpose of our visit. Sliding the folder of documents across the desk, the manager adjusted his tie, scanning the papers carefully, then nodded. Everything looks in order. Emily, if you sign here, your guarantee will be formally withdrawn. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the pen. The paper in front of me was crisp, the black ink line waiting for my name. For years I had signed checks, contracts, authorizations, all binding me tighter to obligations that were never truly mine. Now this single signature could undo them. I pressed the tip of the pen to the page. My breath caught, my chest heavy with the enormity of the moment. Then slowly, carefully, I wrote my name. The sound of the pen scratching across paper was soft but final. When I lifted it, my name gleamed in black ink. A mark of release. The manager stamped the page and gathered the documents. Congratulations. You are no longer a guarantor on these accounts. I let out a shaky breath, my shoulders sagging, as if a weight had slipped off them. My hands were still trembling, but beneath the tremor was something stronger, a sense of freedom I had not felt in years. As we stepped back into the cold evening air, Mark glanced at me. How do you feel? I tightened my coat around me, the wind sharp against my face, like I just cut the chain that has been around my neck for a decade. He smiled faintly. Then you did the right thing. We walked in silence toward the corner, the city lights flickering on as dusk settled. My feet felt lighter with each step, though my heart still beat hard in my chest. I knew the storm that would follow when my family received the notices, but for the first time, I also knew I had the strength to face it. The snow began to fall again, dusting the sidewalks in thin white layers. I tilted my head up, letting the flakes land on my cheeks, melting into the heat of my resolve. The following morning, the storm I had expected began to take shape. My email pinged with notices from the bank confirming the withdrawal of my guarantees. The words were cold and factual, but to me they felt like the first breath of freedom I had taken in years. I sat at my kitchen table in Chicago with a cup of black coffee cooling beside me, staring at the screen. The clock on the wall ticked past 8. Each second building toward the confrontation I knew was coming. By noon, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Missed calls stacked one on top of another. All from Davenport. I ignored them at first, focusing on the reports my firm needed by end of day. But just as the winter sun dipped low behind the high rises, my father's name lit up the screen again. My chest tightened, and this time I answered. His voice exploded through the line, furious and raw. Emily, what have you done? The bank called this morning. They told me you pulled every guarantee. Do you have any idea what you have set in motion? You are tearing this family apart. I pressed my free hand against the desk to steady myself. My voice was calm, though inside I felt the weight of years pressing forward. I only stopped paying for what was never mine to pay. There was a stunned pause, then the sound of movement, voices overlapping on the other end. I heard my mother's anxious whisper, low and sharp, asking him what I had said. Before I could brace myself, another voice cut in, shrill and trembling with rage. How dare you? Emily, it was Sophia. Her words cracking as though she had been waiting all day to unleash them. Do you have any idea what you have done to me? Midwest Media Group called, demanding an explanation for the late payments. They said one more delay and they will end my contract. Do you realize you are ruining everything I worked for? I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. I am not ruining anything. I am simply no longer paying your bills. The rest is up to you. Her breath hitched before it turned into a scream. You are jealous. That is the truth. You hate that Dad is proud of me. You hate that I am the one people talk about. You want me to fall so you can finally look important. Admit it. The accusations seared through the line. But they no longer carved me open. They only revealed how fragile her world really was. I let the silence stretch, her words echoing in the space between us. On the other end, my father seized the phone back, his breathing heavy with rage. Emily, listen to me. Family does not abandon family. You are turning your back on us. And if you keep going down this path, you will regret it. I turned toward the window, the Chicago skyline frozen in ice and steel. Traffic crawling below through slush. My reflection stared back at me, pale but steady. Family stands together when it is mutual, I said softly. Not when one person is carrying everyone else. There was a sharp thud, as though he had slammed his fist against the table. My mother's voice rose faintly in the background, pleading for calm. But my father spoke over her, his tone hard and bitter. You are betraying us. Emily, you are abandoning your sister when she needs you most. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my voice to remain level. I am not abandoning anyone. I am choosing myself for once. The silence on the line was heavy until Sophia snatched the phone again, her words ragged and dripping with venom. You think your boring office job makes you better than me. You think sitting in Chicago with your spreadsheets makes you superior. But when I shine again, and I will, everyone will know you are nothing but bitter and cold. I pressed my lips together, refusing to respond. My silence seemed to inflame her more. She shouted until her voice cracked. You are pathetic. Emily, pathetic and jealous. I held the phone away from my ear, her shrill voice muffled now but still cutting. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the raw force of her anger. I lowered the phone back, steadying myself before speaking. If that is truly what you believe, then nothing I say will change it. Goodbye. I ended the call before another word could be hurled my way. The apartment fell into quiet, only the faint hum of the radiator filling the space. My phone lay dark on the desk, vibrating seconds later with new calls. I ignored. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, my pulse hammering in my ears. My body shook from the confrontation. But underneath the trembling, something else had rooted itself. Steady and unshakable. They had finally shown me their truth. Not gratitude, not even denial, but rage and blame. I stood and walked to the window. Looking down at the streets where the snow had begun to gather in heavy drifts, people hurried past in thick coats, their faces bent against the wind, each of them carrying their own burdens. Mine had been invisible for years, carried quietly and without recognition. But now, for the first time, I had set it down. Behind me, the phone buzzed again, lighting up with their names, each call more desperate than the last. I did not reach for it. I folded my arms across my chest, letting the city lights blur through the frost on the glass. Their anger no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like proof that I had taken back the one thing they never expected me to claim control. I turned from the window. My apartment, quiet and small but finally mine, and let the silence settle into me like armor. It did not take long for the whispers to begin back in Davenport. In small towns, the truth, or at least fragments of it, moved quickly through church basements, grocery store aisles, and coffee counters at the diner. By the first week of January, neighbors were murmuring about the Warrens and how Richard seemed more tense than usual at Sunday service, his jaw tight and his greeting short. I heard the first ripple of it from Aunt Margaret. She called one evening as I sat on my couch with a blanket wrapped around me, the city lights glowing beyond the frosted window. Her voice was steady, her tone as sharp as ever. "Emily, the community is starting to piece things together. Your father is furious, but the truth cannot stay hidden forever." I asked her what she meant. She sighed. A long, weary sound. "He stormed into our cousin David's hardware store yesterday, yelling about betrayal, shouting that you were trying to ruin Sophia's life." People heard every word, but instead of siding with him, they started asking questions. Questions about how Sophia managed all her opportunities. Questions about who was paying for what. I pressed my forehead against my hand, a strange mix of dread and relief washing over me. Margaret continued. "I finally told him the truth when he confronted me after service. I told him I saw you at Christmas. I told him, I know you carried them for years, paid their bills, saved their house." He called me a liar, but I would not back down. Her words tightened my chest. Someone had spoken aloud what I had buried in silence for so long. "Thank you," I whispered. She gave a short laugh. It was time someone said it. The next day at work, between meetings and calls, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number from Iowa. I hesitated before answering. On the other end was my cousin Linda, her voice careful at first, then filled with something softer. "Emily, I just want to say I had no idea. We thought Sophia had built everything herself. But after what Margaret said and what people are talking about, we see it differently now." I sat frozen at my desk, staring at the spreadsheets glowing on my monitor. Linda went on. "You are the one who sacrificed, the one who worked hard and gave without credit. I am sorry we never saw it before. Now we understand who really made it. You." The words sank into me slowly, almost painfully. For years I had dreamed of someone recognizing it. Yet hearing them out loud left me both raw and strangely lighter. I swallowed hard and said quietly, "I never wanted recognition. I just wanted fairness." I could hear her exhale on the line. "Well, you have more respect here now than Sophia does. People are starting to see the difference between gloss and grit." When the call ended, I set the phone down, my hands trembling. A strange ache spread through me. Part sorrow, part release. I thought of all the nights alone in Chicago, wiring money home while everyone else celebrated Sophia's brilliance. I thought of the empty thank yous, the dismissive words, the way my father had called me ordinary. Now, finally, the truth was surfacing, though it carried its own sting. That evening, I went for a walk along the icy sidewalks of my neighborhood. The river glistened under the dim streetlights, chunks of ice drifting slowly beneath the bridges. My breath curled in front of me, the air sharp against my lungs. For the first time, I let myself imagine that maybe I had not been invisible after all. Maybe people had simply chosen not to look until the cracks in the story grew too wide to ignore. The phone rang again later that night. This time it was an older uncle I had barely spoken to in years. His voice was rough, but there was a sincerity in it that startled me. "Emily, I want you to know I misjudged you. We all did. Your father painted one picture, but now the truth is out. You have done more for this family than anyone. And you never boasted about it once. That is real success." I leaned against the counter, my free hand gripping the edge. The words made my eyes sting, though I kept my voice even. "Thank you," I said. After we hung up, I stood in the stillness of my apartment, letting the quiet sink in. The pain of years of dismissal did not vanish, but something inside me shifted. Recognition had come late, but it had come, and with it a measure of peace I had never expected. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the city in white. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window and whispered to myself that, for the first time, the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. A week later, the first envelope arrived at my apartment in Chicago, forwarded mistakenly with my old address, still tied to some of the accounts. The bold black lettering across the top read "Final Notice." My stomach twisted as I opened it, though I already knew what it would say. The Warren family home on Lake Okoboji. The vacation house that had been my father's pride for years was now in default, without my guarantees. The bank demanded full payment, and without it, the house would soon be gone. I folded the letter slowly, laying it on the counter beside the unpaid bills that were no longer mine. For years I had kept their notices hidden, protecting them from shame, carrying the burden in silence. Now the truth was spread across their own kitchen table, undeniable and heavy. 2 days later, I heard from Aunt Margaret again. Her voice was firm, though tinged with disappointment. "Your father is furious, Emily," he shouted in the town square about losing the lake house. People watched him storm into the bank as if he could yell the debt away. "But he knows now. He knows there is nothing left to do." I thanked her quietly. Though my chest ached, my father had built his image on control, on strength. And now the cracks were wide enough for everyone to see. That same week, Sophia's polished veneer began to crumble. Heplo, once filled with polished images of clothes and vacations, grew quiet. Then word spread that Midwest Media Group had pulled their sponsorship after months of late payments and missed deadlines. Her carefully crafted image of independence collapsed in the eyes of her followers. I watched from my apartment, scrolling through the news, seeing comments pile up beneath her posts. People wondered how she had fallen so quickly. They asked what had happened to the bright star my father had always praised. I set my phone down, the glow of the screen fading, and felt a strange mix of sadness and release. One cold Saturday morning, a sharp knock rattled my apartment door. I hesitated, setting down the mug of coffee in my hand, and pulled it open. Sophia stood there, her mascara smudged, her coat thin against the bitter Chicago wind. Her eyes were red, her breath uneven. "Emily, please," she whispered, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door behind her and turned to face her. She stood in the middle of my small living room, looking out of place among the stacks of books and the steady hum of the radiator. She clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white. "They are going to take everything," she said, her voice breaking. "The house, my contracts, all of it. Dad keeps yelling. Mom keeps crying. I cannot fix it. I need you." I stayed silent, watching her as she sank onto my couch, her shoulders trembling. For years she had been the one on the pedestal, the daughter bathed in praise. While I had been dismissed, now she looked small, fragile, her hands shaking as she tried to wipe her tears. Please, Emily, you know how to handle this. You are smart. You have always been the one who could figure things out. If you do not help, I do not know what will happen to us. Her words echoed in the quiet room, but I did not move. I thought of the nights I had gone without sleep, wiring money to cover her debts. I thought of the vacations I never took, the apartments I could barely afford. All so she could post pictures of hotels and dresses. Sophia's eyes searched mine desperately. I know I said things I should not have. I know Dad has hurt you. But you cannot let us fall apart like this. I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. My voice was steady when I finally spoke. I did not let anything happen. Sophia, you built your life on borrowed ground. I am only stepping away. She shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. That is not fair. You are my sister. He swallowed hard, my chest tightening at the word. Sister. It had always meant sacrifice for me. Praise for her. I studied her carefully. The girl who had been raised to shine, but had never learned to stand on her own. In that moment, I saw the stark difference between us. She was dependent, clinging to an image built on borrowed money and empty words. I was tired, but I was standing. The years of labor and restraint shaping me into something she could never understand. Sophia buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled against her palms. I let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate. The sound of her crying filling the room where for once I held the power by saying nothing. The radiator hissed. The snow tapped against the window, and I stood quietly, letting her tears fall, knowing this time I would not bend. The call came late that night, long after Sophia had left my apartment, her cries fading into the quiet halls of the building. I had just rinsed my coffee mug and was about to switch off the lamp when the phone vibrated on the counter. My father's name lit up the screen. I froze, my hand hovering above it, torn between rejecting the call and answering the weight I knew was waiting on the other end. Finally, I pressed accept. His voice came through low, strained. Nothing like the commanding tone I had heard all my life. Emily, listen, maybe I said things I shouldn't have. Maybe I pushed too hard. His voice faltered, then sharpened with a brittle edge. But what you are doing is tearing this family apart. You are breaking us. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge, as if to ground myself. My reply came steady, though my chest tightened. No, Dad. You broke us the moment you looked at me across the Christmas table and called me a failure. You did that? Not me. On the other end, I heard only silence. Then his uneven breathing. For the first time, I had no quick retort. No booming dismissal. He sounded smaller, like a man cornered by truths he had spent years ignoring. I waited, and when he finally spoke, his words were halting. I thought I was motivating you. You've always been strong. Emily, I thought if I praised Sophia, maybe you would fight harder. My throat burned, and I pressed a hand against my chest. Motivating me. That wasn't motivation. That was erasing me. I carried the bills, the debts, the weight of all of you. And you still chose to call me ordinary. You gave my sacrifices to someone else's name. There was another pause. Longer this time. I could picture him sitting at the kitchen table in Davenport, his hands clenched, the old clock on the wall ticking loudly in the silence. Then another voice slipped onto the line, softer but trembling with guilt. Emily, it's your mother. I closed my eyes. Go ahead. Her breath caught before she spoke. I can't undo what we did. But I see it now. I see how much you gave up. Every time we should have stood on our own. You stepped in. And we let you. Her words cracked something open in me. A wound I had pressed down for years. All I ever wanted was for you to see me. I whispered. Just once. To say thank you. To tell me I mattered too. Her voice broke. You do matter. Emily. More than we ever said. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The sound of my father's uneven breathing filled the line. Then another voice came. Faint and unsteady. Sophia. She did not shout this time. Her tone was smaller than I had ever heard it. I never thought about what you did for me. I only thought about what I wanted. What Dad wanted for me. I was blind to everything else. The words hung heavy, and I let the silence stretch. She went on, her voice cracking. I am sorry. I could imagine her in that kitchen. Eyes red, face down. No makeup or camera to protect her. Just raw. Unvarnished shame. Dad's voice broke in again. Quiero. Almost pleading. Emily. We need you. If you step away completely, I don't know what will happen to us. I shook my head. Even though he could not see me, you don't understand. Dad. You taught me I was nothing. And still, I gave everything. You don't get to ask me to save you now. The line went quiet. My mother whispered. Barely audible. She's right. Richard. We pushed too hard. We leaned too much. For once. My father did not argue. His silence was heavier than any outburst he could have thrown at me. I felt tears pressing at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. This was not about breaking down. This was about standing firm. I said quietly, I won't carry it anymore. I won't carry you. Or Sophia. Or anyone else. From here on, you stand or you fall on your own. There was a muffled sound on the line, like a chair scraping back. And then Sophia's voice again. Softer still. I understand. The weight of those words filled the air. Heavier than her screaming had ever been. The three of them stayed on the line. But no one spoke. For the first time in my life, the silence belonged to me. I glanced out the window at the Chicago streets below, where snowflakes drifted under the orange glow of the street lamps. The radiator hummed, steady and warm. And I stood there holding the phone, listening to the quiet of a family that had finally run out of excuses. Sophia did not lift her head. My mother did not argue. And my father, the man who had once thundered over all of us, stayed utterly silent. By the time spring arrived, the snow in Chicago had melted into slush that ran down the gutters and carried winter away. The air felt lighter. And for the first time in months, I packed a small bag and drove west toward Davenport. The highway stretched ahead under a sky washed clean. And with each mile, the weight of winter seemed to slip further behind me. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The shutters needed paint. The flower beds lay bare. But it was quiet. No longer humming with the constant pretense of perfection. My mother greeted me at the door. Her smile subdued. Her eyes softer. My father sat at the kitchen table, his coffee mug cupped between his hands. He looked up, nodded once, and said nothing. Later that afternoon, I carried a chair into the backyard and sat facing the Mississippi River. The water glistened under the early spring sun, slow and steady in its flow, as if it had always known how to keep moving forward, no matter what tried to weigh it down. I let the breeze brush against my face and listened to the quiet of the neighborhood, birds calling from the budding trees. Sophia stepped outside after a while, her shoulders rounded, her voice lower than I had ever heard it. She told me she had applied for a job at a local marketing firm. Nothing glamorous. No bright lights or sponsorships. Just steady work. Her words carried no pride, only a trace of humility. I nodded, listening, not judging, letting her find her own path without my shadow to hold her up. My father eventually came out too, his steps slower, his frame less rigid. He settled into a chair a few feet from mine and stared out at the river without speaking. The silence stretched between us, not hostile, not heavy, simply there. For years I had dreaded silence, fearing it meant rejection. Now I understood it differently. Sometimes silence meant there were no excuses left to give, only acceptance. My mother brought out a pitcher of lemonade, her hands careful, her movements unhurried. She set it on the table between us and glanced at me. There was something in her eyes I had not seen before, something like recognition. She did not say the words, but I could feel them. We sat together, the four of us, not pretending, not fighting, only existing in the stillness. For the first time in my life, I felt no urge to fill the air, no need to explain or defend. My boundaries had already been drawn, sharp and clear, and they understood it now without me having to repeat them. The river shimmered. The wind carried the faint smell of earth waking after winter. And I thought of all the years I had carried them, all the nights I had written checks instead of dreams, all the times I had accepted their words like chains. I thought of the girl who had once been invisible at the Christmas table, and I realized she no longer lived here. When I finally rose to leave, my father stood too, his mouth opening as if to speak. Then closing again, he reached out, not with words, but with a hesitant touch on my shoulder. It was not an apology, not quite forgiveness, but it was something real. My mother hugged me longer than she ever had, and Sophia simply looked at me with eyes that no longer carried rivalry, only quiet acknowledgement. As I drove back toward Chicago, the sky painted in soft streaks of pink and gold, I let the peace settle inside me. I knew they would stumble, perhaps fall again, but I also knew it would no longer be my responsibility to catch them. I had given enough. Silence was no longer my weakness, it was my shield. My way of choosing myself after years of being erased. It was not running away. It was drawing a line and standing firm. And that is where my story leaves me. Sitting in that silence, no longer broken by it, but strengthened through it. If this story touched you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings in the comments. Let me know if you have ever had to set boundaries with family. And do not forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories about family, justice, and finding your own voice.